started so we have enough time for all the great content that we have today. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know everyone's so busy and we're thankful that you're here. Thank you for joining us for this part 2 of our Navigating Mainstream Benefits training series. Today's training is going to focus on CalWORKS. Our last training focused on CalFresh, and I'll give a little preview of kind of what's coming next in the series. Just a quick intro for those of you that don't know me. My name is Carla Carvalho, and I'm a senior policy analyst at Homebase. You probably see many emails from me and are probably sick of seeing emails from me on the listservs, but I sort of help with Homebase in coordinating these trainings. And if you don't know about Homebase, we're a nonprofit technical assistance provider. So we provide technical assistance for CoCs across the nation. And we work really closely with Santa Clara and the Office of Supportive Housing. And one of the main things that we do for OSH is we bring you trainings, including this Navigating Mainstream Benefits series. And so yeah, thank you for joining us today. And we're constantly kind of hoping to improve our trainings and look at all of your feedback and want the trainings to be as helpful to you all in your work as possible. So towards the end of the training, I'm going to be popping in like a link to our feedback survey on this training in particular. And we really appreciate if you could take just a couple minutes to fill that out and give us feedback so that we can take that for next year, especially since this is like a kind of repeat series that we try to bring back every single year. I would really appreciate that. And I will also follow up with an email as well. So just to give you a little preview, like I said, this is part 2. This is focused on CalWORKS. And then we are going to also have a part 3 that will be focused on Medi-Cal, Medicare, and Covered California. That date will be announced the same way that we announced this training via the CoC and the SPN listserv. And then we will also have a part 4, which will focus on WIC, general assistance, SSI, and SSDI, and that date is also to be announced. And just like for this training, registration is required for both trainings. And what will happen is you'll register on Zoom, you'll receive your unique Zoom link, and you'll use that to access these trainings. So I know we're all very familiar with Zoom by now, but just a reminder, when you came in, you were muted, and we just ask that folks stay muted if you're not speaking, because it's just helpful with such a large crowd. We do have a live transcript function that's enabled. So if you would like to receive the closed caption, you can enable that on your end. Please utilize the chat box. It's a great place to pop in questions and comments throughout the training. And then I forgot to change the name on here. My colleague Max was doing the last training, but if you have any issues, please direct message me, or you can email me at carla@homebasecc.org. So instead of Max, I will be monitoring the email if you get like kicked off of Zoom or anything like that. And then just a quick icebreaker to get folks like warmed up in the chat. If you could please type into the chat box your name, what organization you're with, if that's applicable to you, and then what's one word that you'd use to describe yourself. And I can say, my name's Carla, Homebase, and one word I'd use to describe myself is warm. I think that's a good one. So while folks are kind of warming up in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I am going to actually pass it off to Lisa and Juliana, our wonderful trainers that are here, so they can kind of get set up and introduce themselves to begin the training.
Welcome, everyone. I'm going to just take a moment to get our view sorted. And Juliana, feel free to start introducing yourself.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Juliana Mancini, and I am a staff attorney at Bay Area Legal Aid. I practice in public benefits, and so part of my work is helping people with their CalWORKS benefits, including overpayments, denials, and terminations.
And I'm Lisa Newstrom. I'm the managing attorney at Bay Area Legal Aid. I also practice in public benefits and a little bit in immigration. We're going to talk about some non-citizen issues related to CalWORKS today. And I'm really excited to share this information with this group. I think CalWORKS is a fantastic and underutilized program for helping to stabilize families with children, and to help bring a lot of really useful supportive services into their lives. And I hope today we're just going to do kind of like, you know, the mile high view of the whole program. Our goals for you are not for you to be able to assess in great detail whether every particular family you work with is eligible for CalWORKS, but to be able to flag families that may likely be eligible for CalWORKS, and also to understand a little bit more of the role of legal services and how we can work with housing providers to kind of assist families, and with the county as well, with social services, to assist families and ensure that they are able to apply when they should be eligible and keep those benefits when they should be keeping them. So with that, we are going to jump in. Okay.
All right, so as Lisa and I both said, we work for Bay Area Legal Aid. Bay Area Legal Aid is the largest provider of free civil legal services to low-income people living in the Bay Area. We serve lots of counties, so not just Santa Clara County. We serve people in Alameda, Contra Costa, Marin, Napa, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Santa Clara. And we also have lots of areas of practice. Public benefits is just one of them. And it fits under the economic justice category here, but we also do homeless prevention, including landlord-tenant, unlawful evictions, fair housing, law enforcement. We do interpersonal violence prevention, which includes DV, SA, and HT, which stands for human trafficking or sexual assaults. In that area, we do restraining orders, family law, and survivor-related immigration. We have a youth justice project, which does all of these areas, but for a specific population, the youth population. As I said, there's also economic justice. And in that area, we do denials, terminations, and overpayments in public safety net programs, including CalWORKS, CalFresh, General Assistance, and Social Security. We have a consumer law unit that does debtors' rights and fair credit reporting. And lastly, we have our healthcare access team, and they do a lot of things, but among those things, they do denials and terminations in public health insurance programs, healthcare exchange, and health consumer issues such as bills if people are having issues with getting their bills covered by their insurance, or denials.
Okay, so talking today, we're going to focus on CalWORKS. We may also mention some of the other programs Juliana mentioned, like CalFresh, SSI, run by Social Security Administration, General Assistance, which it's great to see you all are going to have a training on later. There are other programs that are specifically for certain populations of immigrants, such as the Trafficking and Crime Victim Assistance Program, TCVAP, Refugee Cash Assistance, and the Cash Assistance Program for Immigrants, CAPI, which is specifically for elderly and disabled immigrants. So we're going to talk about CalWORKS today. But just know that when you're working with a family, you may have different individuals who are in that family who are eligible for different programs. If you come from a different state, you may have heard of the program TANF. TANF is the federal name for the CalWORKS program. And so back in the 1990s, the AFDC program, Aid for Families with Dependent Children, was replaced with TANF, which emphasized the temporary nature of the assistance. It emphasized work rules, and it switched to a block grant formula. And so TANF programs may look very different in different states. There are many fewer federal regulations around what those programs need to look like than there were before 1996. So if you are working with a family that's coming from, say, Nevada, their benefits in the past may look different than their benefits now. California's TANF program is called CalWORKS, which is actually an acronym for the California Work Opportunity and Responsibility to Kids program. And like I said, it's intended to be time limited for adults and moving people to employment. So we're going to talk about some of those issues. We're also going to talk about the challenges some people face with moving to employment, and the ways in which the program is supposed to understand and be flexible for those individuals. And that is one of the areas where we find a lot of folks challenged, both to apply and to keep their benefits. When we talk about CalWORKS, eligibility is complex. So we're going to talk about general eligibility, who can qualify, and how financially needy do you have to be to get this program. Other questions of like certain demographics that can get the program or can't get the program. We're also going to talk about welfare to work and what you have to do to keep getting the cash aid. These are sometimes called category eligibility, the demographics, and process eligibility, like what do you have to do? Okay. Most people who have trouble applying, who are denied, or who fall off the program because they're terminated, it's typically not because they don't meet the category eligibility. It's typically because they don't meet the process eligibility at some point. Okay. Okay, so when we're talking about CalWORKS eligibility, in general, to start with, it is a program for families with children. And a family, or an assistance unit, as it's called in CalWORKS, has to include, the family has to include a caretaker relative with at least one minor child in the home, or it can be a single individual who is pregnant. And if there is split custody between parents, which parent is the caretaker relative? For purposes of CalWORKS, it is whoever has care and control 51% of the time. If they are exactly split 50-50, and like you can like actually draw that out by the hour, by the day, over the course of a month, then it's just going to be who applied first, unless there's some sort of court order saying that like parent 1 or parent 2 should be able to apply for the CalWORKS. Also, in terms of saying a minor child, an 18-year-old can count as a minor if they are finishing high school. Okay. In addition to having that caretaker relative, the adult caretaker relative and the minor child, the child must be deprived of parental support or care in some way. Typically, this is because one parent is absent from the home, but it could also be because the parent is deceased, or it could be a two-parent family where one parent is incapacitated, unemployed, or underemployed. And there's a very technical definition for underemployed. You also have to be a California resident and a resident of the county where you're applying for aid. So some programs, like for example, EDD programs, state disability unemployment insurance, you can apply in any office because it's a state program. You can apply for SSI at any Social Security office. It's a federal program. CalWORKS is a state program, but it is operated by counties, and so you are supposed to apply with the county you live in. For homeless clients, this is sometimes a challenge if they've moved between counties and they need to prove which county they live in. So that's an area where folks run into issues sometimes, and we can talk a little bit about that later. Okay. We also want to mention because in Santa Clara County, we have a lot of folks from diverse national origins. We have folks with a variety of immigration statuses. And so when we're talking about eligibility for immigrants or for non-citizens, there are certain terms of art that are going to come up. So there's this idea of qualified immigrants, and I put the silly finger quotes around it because it sounds like a qualified immigrant is someone who's qualified to get CalWORKS, but that is not in fact the case. It's a list that was created back in 1996 of certain immigrants who have kind of like special status when you're talking about federally funded benefits, programs, and services. So on the qualified immigrants list is people with green cards who are lawful permanent residents, and a lot of humanitarian immigrants, such as refugees, asylees, trafficking survivors who have a T visa and have a certain certification from the federal government. Battered spouses or children of US citizens or LPRs, and they are eligible as soon as they have something called a prima facie determination. And then more recently, certain Afghan and Ukrainian humanitarian parolees, or for Afghans, there's also folks who have something called special immigration status. There's also a couple of more obscure, very, very small populations, but those are the main ones that we see in Santa Clara County who are on the qualified immigrants list. There are other folks who are not on that list who are nonetheless potentially eligible for CalWORKS. And so that's really important to understand. If you're looking at federal materials and it says these are the qualified immigrants for TANF, that circle is going to be smaller than the circle of people who are eligible in California. So in California, we have also recognized that certain immigrants who are in the process of getting status based on being victims of crimes really need that economic support while they're in that process. So in California, folks who are victims of crime who are applying for a U visa, which some of you may have heard of, are eligible from the point they apply through when they have the U visa. Survivors of human trafficking, I mentioned once they go through this process and get a visa and have this federal certification, they're on the qualified immigrants list. But even before that, that process takes a while to go through. And so in California, they can be eligible from the moment they are working up a filing for that status. We also have eligibility for folks who are applying for or who have been granted rather an indefinite stay of deportation or removal, or who have indefinite voluntary departure. Those are rare, very specific term of art statuses under immigration law. There's also something called permanently residing under color of law. And this is a category for immigrants who have some sort of status that the federal government has recognized. Sometimes it's that they're in process of something, like in the process of applying for asylum, for example, and they may have been given a work permit. They may have some paperwork that shows immigration knows they are here and is okay with them being here for the time being, even though they haven't been officially granted a status. That's what's called permanently residing under color of law, that immigration knows they're here and has no intent to deport them. Okay.
All right, so the CalWORKS Assistance Unit, as Lisa said, that's what CalWORKS calls the family or the household. They call for CalWORKS it's an assistance unit. So for the assistance unit, some people who live together are required to actually be in an assistance unit. So for example, a parent and the minor children are required to be in an assistance unit. There are some people who can choose to not be in an assistance unit, such as immigrant family members, including parents, so people who are not going to be possibly are not eligible to be in the assistance unit are not going to be required to be in the assistance unit, but also step parents who don't have children in the household are not going to be required to be in the assistance unit. They could choose to be in the assistance unit if they wanted, but they would not be required to be in the assistance unit. A non-parent caretaker can choose to get aid for just the children. So if a child is living with their grandparents, that grandparent could apply for CalWORKS for just the children. And that unaided caretaker's income and resources would not count for the children's financial eligibility.
And that's just a really important thing to look at when you're looking at children who are maybe living with kinship caregivers who are not their parents. You can look at the budget both ways, and whichever way it is more advantageous for the family, that caregiver, if they are otherwise eligible, they can opt in or out of the program. So sometimes, for example, grandma might have Social Security or a pension or something, and her income would lower the grant. And so it's more advantageous for grandma to be out of the CalWORKS unit, and then her income doesn't count. And let's say she has 3 grandkids, they just get aid for the 3. Whereas other times, if grandma's income is lower or she doesn't have income, they may want to get aid for a family of 4 with grandma included.
And kind of like we were talking about, these are just some examples. So example 1 is of a family is mom, boyfriend, and mom's 2 children, ages 4 and 10. In this case, the boyfriend isn't the children's biological parent, so the boyfriend is not a mandatory member of that assistance unit. Example 2, the family is mom, dad, 3 children, ages 10, 15, and 18. In this case, mom, dad, and children ages 10 and 15 would be in the assistance unit, but the child who's age 18 may or may not be in the assistance unit, depending on whether or not they were still in high school. So there's kind of a follow-up question there to figure out whether or not that 18-year-old would be in the assistance unit. And the last example is a family with grandma and 4 minor children. And as Lisa just said, this is one of those situations where you can run the budget both ways and see what is most advantageous for the family in terms of how to maximize the amount of benefits they can get.
And because we mentioned some other benefit programs, like most commonly CalFresh, one thing I just want to mention is that these rules for who is in and out of the unit are different between different programs. So for example, in the example of mom, boyfriend, and mom's 2 kids, boyfriend may or may not be in the CalFresh unit, depending on whether they're buying and preparing food together, and boyfriend's income may or may not count. So it is always better when family is applying. If they are living together with other people, they can mention those other people to the county and let the county kind of do their assessment of who needs to be in or out of the unit, because the family doesn't want to be accused of misrepresenting or hiding. They may be told, oh, well, boyfriend doesn't matter for CalWORKS, but boyfriend may matter for CalFresh, and boyfriend's income may matter for CalFresh. And in some situations, it can actually increase their benefits. So different units for different benefits is important for people to understand. Okay. Okay, so how? Oh,
Lisa,
yes.
can I call out a question from Craig in the chat? He asked, so example 1, can mom apply just for her child?
No.
Yes. So mom cannot
would need to be.
Yes, as Juliana mentioned, sorry, I was just saying yes to the question. As Juliana mentioned, certain people are mandatory members of the assistance unit. And so if they live together, mom and children need to be in the same unit unless mom is either not eligible for some reason, often because of immigration status, or if she is an immigrant who is eligible, she can still opt to be out of the unit if she wishes. Some immigrants are concerned that getting benefits may impact their pathway. We're going to talk about that later. And for 99.9% of immigrants, that's not going to be an issue. But because of that, they have the option to opt out. And so, for example, mom in this case, if she were eligible to opt out, she would only get aid for a family of 2. But otherwise, normally parents and children need to be together. Good question.
Thank you. Yeah, we also had somebody ask what the difference between CalFresh and CalWORKS is. And, you know, CalFresh, making the distinction, CalFresh is the food stamps, so the nutrition side of things, and then CalWORKS is cash assistance and also some supportive services. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. So when we talk about cash assistance, it's not actual like paper bills. It used to be actual paper checks that people got in the mail many years ago. Now everybody has that like plastic EBT card, and your CalWORKS, if you're getting both CalWORKS and CalFresh, they are both loaded on the same card. But when you swipe it, you can choose which one you are doing. And so, for example, CalFresh covers food, but it doesn't cover toothpaste or toilet paper or, you know, laundry detergent, the many things families need. And so when we say cash aid for CalWORKS, that means they can use it for things, you know, for anything you can use cash for. So for example, paying rent, buying toothpaste, buying toilet paper. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so just to give you, we're going to show you these current numbers. Know that these numbers change every year. Some years they change multiple times because of different budget amounts. So the income test for applicants just adjusted in July. The income limits and the maximum aid payment for recipients is going to go up in October. We are filming this for anyone who's watching later on in August, almost. And so just know that these numbers in the future may be different, but this is just to give you an idea of how financial eligibility works. And why you can have 2 families that might look somewhat similar, but have different outcomes in terms of whether they are eligible for CalWORKS and how much CalWORKS they get. Okay.
And is that gross? I'm sorry, is that gross income monthly or annual? Somebody asked.
It's monthly income.
We're going to talk about monthly numbers. And that's the most useful income to look at when you are looking at most public benefits programs. So for applicants, they have to have gross income under what is on this chart of the following income limits. And this is called the minimum basic standard of adequate care. So for a family of 2, for example, mom and 1 kid, let's say, they have to have gross pre-tax income of under $1,415 a month. And the only thing that is excluded when you're deciding what their income is, comparing it to that number, is the first $450 of earned income. All other income is countable. Okay.
And are those numbers the same for CalFresh as well?
No, CalFresh is a completely different program. It has completely different income information. So other than mentioning that CalFresh exists, we're not going to get too far into CalWORKS in this training. We could do a whole other 2 hours on CalFresh. Good questions though. Okay, so if the countable income is over the limit, the family is not going to qualify as an applicant for CalWORKS. Okay.
And someone also asked, does child support count as income in this situation?
Typically, yes. It is going to count if the child is in the assistance unit. So there may be situations in which the child is not in the assistance unit. For example, if the child is on SSI because they have a disability, Or you can have situations, remember how I said a parent and their child that lives with them have to be in the same unit. There is an exception to that it's relatively new and we're not going to go into too much detail today. But if, let's say you have two children with different parents who are outside of the home. So let's say mom and child one, who gets child support from child one's other parent, and child two, who lives with mom and does not get child support or gets a lower amount of child support. Mom can opt to have child one who gets the child support out of the unit. She won't get, when they calculate household size, they're not going to include child one. So it won't be a family of 3, it'll be a family of 2. But there is a way to opt out. It's very technical and you have to meet certain criteria.
Lisa,
Okay.
I did just also want to note, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but there are 2 regions, so these numbers might not apply specifically for people watching this later or people not located in Santa Clara County. These might not be the actual numbers for your county, depending on which region you are located in. And I believe Santa Clara is in region 1, which has a higher numbers than region 2. There are 2 regions, region 1 and region 2.
Thank you for flagging that. Yes, so this is in Santa Clara County as of July 27th, 2023. And like I said, these numbers will change all the time, but this is just to give you a ballpark idea and to understand kind of the mechanics. So let's say my income is under that limit on the last slide. So let's say I'm a family of 2 and our gross income is 1,000. Let's keep it simple, 1,000 a month. Okay, so we qualify under the applicant test, but how much could I actually get if I'm a recipient? I still have to look at the recipient test and I have to be under that amount as well. And so for 2 people, for most families, the maximum aid is going to be $895. So if my full $1,000 is countable, I might still not get benefits. If all adults in the household are like on disability benefits or are elderly or meet certain other exemptions, then my maximum aid could be slightly higher. It could be actually 1,000 for a family of 2. When we count income, we're going to talk on the next slide about certain things that are exempt from counting as income. But generally, you talk about earned and unearned income. And then when you talk about, so earned being any money that comes from work. Unearned income being any money that doesn't come from work. And within unearned income, CalWORKS has special rules that apply to disability-based income. So that could be like Social Security disability. It could also be income that like a child gets based on their parents' disability. So like disabled veterans, sometimes like their child can get a benefit, or Social Security child benefit. And when we're counting the income to compare it with this, disability or earned income is going to get a $600 total deduction. So let's say my $1,000 is $500 of that is from disability and $500 is from work. I'm going to get to take my $500 disability is going to be totally exempt. I have $100 left over that I'm going to take away from my earned income. So I'm down to $400 of earned income counting. And then my earned income gets a further 50% deduction. So instead of counting $400, it's going to be $200. So when I compare to the maximum aid, let's say I don't meet the exempt limit, so my max aid is $895. I'm going to subtract that $200 and my grant amount would be $695. If my countable income after I did all that kind of math was higher than the maximum aid for my family size, I don't get anything. Okay. Our goal is not for you to know how to do that budget. You don't need to remember everything I just said. What I do want you to understand, though, is that different types of income gets counted different ways, that generally earned income gets more deductions than unearned income, that there's special rules if it comes from disability. And so those are all important facts for the county to have and for clients to understand about what their income is. And that can also explain why you have two families that on paper look like they're similar sizes and similar levels of income, but one qualifies for aid and one doesn't. Okay. When we talk about examples of excluded income, just some common things. So if the child is on CalWORKS and getting child support, the first $100 of child support is called a pass-through, and the rest of the child support will be paid to the county, but the family gets $100 and that $100 is excluded. If there's 2 or more kids, they get a $200 pass-through. Most student-related money, like work study, education loans and grants, that is exempt. So if you have a parent who's enrolled, say in community college, and they have a work study job, none of that job money counts. So that's a really important thing a lot of people don't know. Money you get in the form of like a tax refund, such as the earned income tax credit, doesn't count as income. In-kind support from a nonprofit organization. So that's like if, let's say in Santa Clara County, maybe Sacred Heart helps pay some money towards your rent and they pay it directly to the landlord, that does not count. Any kind of in-kind, meaning not cash, but paying a bill for you, item of partial need doesn't count. So for example, unless it pays the entire amount of your rent. So that can be really important. Like if mom pays, so if it comes from a nonprofit, it's exempt altogether. But let's say mom pays $50 and grandma, who doesn't live with the family, pays $1,000 of their rent because grandma's pitching in and helping out because mom is struggling. As long as mom pays $1 of her rent herself, the $1,000 from grandma doesn't count as income. Personal loans, if it's actually like grandma says, I'll give you $1,000, but you got to repay it, that also doesn't count as income. It's got to be a legally binding loan though. So like usually that means in California, you want it to be in writing. Much better for it to be in writing. Also money you get as back pay because that you were underpaid, CalWORKS is exempt. Also some other benefits that you may have been underpaid, like Social Security, can be exempt for a certain period of time. Okay. And then the last thing we're going to talk about in terms of income for non-citizens who have a sponsor. And that is typically just for folks who come in on a family-based green card, where a family member sponsored them. It doesn't apply to refugees who have like, may have been sponsored by like a church or a nonprofit or something like this. We're talking about family sponsors or family-based immigration, where the sponsor may or may not be a family member. But in that case, the sponsor has signed a certain agreement with the government. And so the income and resources of the sponsor count for CalWORKS eligibility until the immigrant basically works in the US for about 10 years or becomes a US citizen. There are some exceptions for this though. And if people need CalWORKS, it's often that the exceptions apply. Otherwise, if they were getting supported by their sponsor at the level that the sponsor is supposed to be supporting them, they don't usually need CalWORKS. So it's kind of a catch-22. If you are seeing someone who is sponsored, who is applying for CalWORKS, it's very likely that they will run into issues with that. But it's also very likely that they should meet some of the exemptions for that. So for example, they can get exempted from sponsor deeming for 1 year if the family would otherwise be hungry or homeless. Also, if there is domestic abuse or the sponsor is abusive or deeming would exacerbate the DV. For example, like sometimes the sponsor might be an in-law of the abuser or something like that. So those are the situations we see quite frequently. Sponsor deeming itself is very rare, but when we do see it, it's often a situation like that, and that is exactly why the family needs CalWORKS.
And Lisa, I just wanted to lift up 2 income-related questions. The first one was, does IHSS or the in-home supportive services count toward income?
Yes, and it needs to be reported. I'm assuming they're talking about as an IHSS worker, not the person receiving services. But the person working for IHSS would need to report that income to the county. And that is actually a very common issue that we see because the county is the person paying. Oftentimes, the worker believes that the county already knows about that income. So it's very important that if you are an IHSS worker, that you do report that income to the county.
Yes. And it's not just that they believe the county knows about the income. The county does know about the income, and the county actually approves and authorizes the exact number of hours and sets the wage rate. And so this is a common kind of point of tension between advocates and CDSS, that like the county on the one hand is issuing a paycheck and literally knows exactly how much the family is making, but then on the other hand will accuse them of not reporting that information back to the county, and will cause an overpayment. So we're always working to like see if there are ways to make that system better. But in the meantime, yes, if people are working as an IHSS provider, they should report that income. If they are receiving IHSS services from someone outside the household, the amount that the county pays that worker does not count as income to the recipient.
Thank you. And then the other question was just, does earned income count if somebody gets paid under the table, which is something that especially impacts folks that are undocumented?
Yeah, so yes, a few things about that though. If the person is not work authorized, they may not also be eligible for CalWORKS themselves, but it is important. There are rules if, for example, they are a parent, even though they're not in that assistance unit, a certain amount of their income will be deemed to the children that are in the assistance unit that are eligible. The county is not in the business of immigration enforcement. What the county wants to know is what your income is. And so what I would tell someone who is working under the table is that when they are talking with the county, they need to be truthful about what their income is. They also do not need to overshare about what their immigration status is. They can say, I'm not an eligible immigrant. There are many people who are not eligible immigrants who are lawfully present in the US, like people on student visas, for example. But they can say, I'm working and I don't have, I don't have a regular paycheck. I get paid in cash. It's not illegal to get paid in cash. The county will probably want a signed statement from the employer. Understandably, many employers who are paying their workers in cash do not want to sign anything. In that situation, the person is supposed to be able to self-verify, do a sworn statement saying, this is my job, this is how much I make each month. They should keep records of how much they make. Many folks who are undocumented and getting paid in cash are keeping those records anyways and are paying taxes on their income. I think that surprises some folks, that most folks who are undocumented are actually paying taxes. And so, yeah, so they should report it. And if they run into issues and the county says, oh, we can't accept that, we need to talk to your boss, and if your boss won't talk to us, no CalWORKS, that would be the sort of thing to refer to legal aid for assistance. Okay.
All right, resources. So this is kind of the other half of the financial eligibility for CalWORKS. So resources are any property that the family owns that has monetary value. So this could be, you know, a car, which is an excluded resource. We'll get to that. But the examples we have here are bank accounts or lump sum payments. But it's important to note that the resource needs to actually be available. So something that we commonly see is victims of domestic violence maybe don't have access to their bank account because they're escaping their abuser or things of that nature. And it's important to remember that that resource needs to be actually available. So if something like that does come up and people are getting pushback from the county, that is something that you can refer to legal aid for assistance. There is a resource limit. The resource limit is $10,888 for families in general, or it's $16,333 for families with a disabled family member or a family member that is over 60 years old. All right, so there are, like I said, there are resources that are exempt, meaning that they do not count against a family towards that resource limit. So some exempt resources are things like the home where the family lives, household goods, so beds, furniture, those types of things, tools that the recipient needs for work. So if someone's a handyman or a gardener, the tools that they own for that job are not going to be counted as a resource. And as I kind of talked about a little bit, for victims of domestic violence, community property that requires consent of the abuser is going to be an exempt resource. A vehicle is an exempt resource, but only if it's for one of these purposes. So it needs to be used to transport a physically disabled household member, or if it's used as a home, or used to transport heating, fuel, or water, or if it's used for employment, or if it's received as a gift, donation, or a family transfer. If the vehicle is not exempt, it counts for its equity value minus $32,045. And this amount just recently went up. It was significantly less. So that was something that advocates have really been pushing for.
And yeah, it used to be that basically your car had to be non-functional in order to be exempt. And of course, that causes problems when people are living in a state that doesn't have, comprehensive transit to a lot of employment opportunities. If you want people to get jobs, having transportation is really important. So, that was the thinking on raising that vehicle rate, especially with the kind of soaring cost of vehicles and inflation. Those Blue Book values were going up. The upshot of this, though, is that most vehicles should be exempt right now. Most of our clients who are needing CalWORKS do not have a vehicle that they own outright that is worth more than 32 grand. So, if people are getting cut off for resources, it is typically just because there is a gap in communication about what the resource is, who owns it, or what it's worth.
Or what it's being used for.
And someone asked, will the cash portion of CalWORKS need to be repaid by the person receiving the aid?
No.
No. That is something that some GA programs do require you to repay. Santa Clara does not require you to repay GA. So in Santa Clara County, there are no welfare programs that require repayment. The only exception is if you're getting GA while applying for SSI, they can reimburse the GA out of the back benefits. But that is a common myth about CalWORKS.
All right, so now we're kind of gonna start talking about the hoops that people have to jump through in order to remain on CalWORKS benefits. So we're gonna start talking about welfare to work. And so what is welfare to work? Essentially what welfare to work is that any adult CalWORKS recipient is required to either be working or to be engaged in what they call job readiness activities. And these can be things like getting your GED, going to school, like getting a higher education degree, like going to college, or job skills classes, or even ESL. There are required hours, and they're very specific based on the number of parents in the household and the ages of the children. They range anywhere from 20 to 35 hours. And for that 35 hours, that is for a 2-parent household, and it is combined. So between both parents, that 35 hours is split. There are people who can be exempt from welfare to work. And you know, the most common exemption is for disability, and that does need to be certified by a medical professional. There are other exemptions as well, such as for domestic violence. And people who are exempt can volunteer to participate fully or partially in welfare to work activities.
So just an example of what that volunteering might look like, you could have someone who is, let's say I'm a single parent, my children are 6 or older, but I'm also fleeing domestic violence and I'm having to like spend a lot of time going to court, taking my kids to therapy, stuff like that. And I say, you know what, I cannot do 30 hours a week. I get a DV exception, which we'll talk about later. So I'm exempt from being required to do 30 hours a week, but I say, but I do want to do some work and I can volunteer to work at least, let's say 15 or 20 hours a week. And so then for those 15 or 20 hours, I work and I can get all the supportive services for work, such as childcare, which is huge. But I can't be penalized if, like, let's say there's a trial in my family court and I can't show up for a week, like I can't be penalized as a volunteer.
All right, so education may be under a self-initiated plan if it's started prior to CalWORKS. And for the first 24 months, you can do any activity in the assessment, which includes school.
Okay, so what are the exemptions? Oh, just on that last slide, I'll mention. So normally the county does an assessment when you start CalWORKS and they decide like which activities would be appropriate for you. And then you negotiate with the county to create a plan that you and the county agree on for what you're going to do for your hours. During the first 24 months, you can do any activity that would like increase your employability. After that, you generally have to do like the county can set restrictions and say like, we think, you know, you've done enough job readiness. We want you to do subsidized employment next or something like that. When can you be exempt from these welfare to work rules? So based on age, you're too young, or if you're 60 or older, you're not required to do it. If you have a disability, it does require you to get medical verification. If you are caring for an ill or incapacitated member of the home, so let's say you have a child who is very ill a lot and you can't work full-time because of that. There are also exemptions for parents of young children. And these are, so once in a lifetime, you can get an exemption for a child up to 23 months old. And then let's say you have a second child. With the second child, you don't get another 23 months. You can get up to 6 months. And that is also once in a lifetime. And then after that, it depends on the county, but at minimum, They can't make you work if you have a child under 3 months old. But you can also choose to take those in different order. So for example, let's say your first child, you feel ready to return to work at 6 months. You can do that and you can save. And then if you have another child, you can take the 23 months. So it doesn't have to be in order from most time to least time, although most people do it that way. You can also be exempt from welfare to work if you are a non-parent caring for a child at risk of foster care. So like if CPS has placed the child in the home of aunt, for example, aunt doesn't necessarily need to work. If you are pregnant, you are exempt. That is new, that all you have to be is pregnant. It used to be that you had to be pregnant, and I think in the 3rd trimester. Because of recognizing the difficulty that many people who are pregnant have with getting a job when you are pregnant, and that many employers, whether lawfully or not, will not hire someone who they know is expecting and is going to like not be able to work soon. So now in CalWORKS, there's no trimester requirement. And then one of the more common ones that we see is when we're working with families who are using CalWORKS to escape from domestic violence. So if anything about participating in welfare to work would make it harder for you to escape the domestic violence, or if you are impaired in any way from doing welfare to work hours because of the domestic violence. So like the example I gave is a parent who is like needing to do support groups for themselves, needing to like get trauma services for their children, needing to navigate court issues related to the DV. All of that can interfere with your ability to do those like 20, 25, 30 hours of work. Okay.
We have a couple of questions related to the exemptions. Somebody asked, if a mother is exempt from this list and gets income from a disability, can they still apply?
Absolutely, they can still apply. So welfare to work is about the requirements to keep benefits. The financial eligibility is separate. She would still need to report her disability-based income, and she would still need to meet all those financial eligibility rules. It's just that once she gets benefits, she can't be cut off of benefits for not working.
And then the other question is, what about when somebody gives birth? How long do they have the exemption for?
So that's the young child exemption that I just talked about.
Right. And then we did have a question that the person asked, does CalWORKS make the other parent, let's say an absent parent, pay anything, or does it require the person who's applying for CalWORKS to file for child support?
We are going to talk about child support requirements, so we'll get to that.
Awesome, thank you.
Good question. Okay, so just generally, welfare to work is mandatory unless people are exempt. So unless they have an official exemption granted by the county, they can be penalized if they don't do their hours. And so any adult not complying with the welfare to work requirements can be sanctioned, which is basically being removed from the unit for purposes of the benefit. But you can avoid being sanctioned if you have good cause for not doing your hours. And the good cause, some of these things might lead to reasons why you should actually be exempt. But a good cause can also just be a more transient thing, like I just couldn't do it this month. So for example, if the county didn't provide supportive services, so if you didn't have childcare available, you can't work if you're a single parent. Because remember, to get these benefits in the first place, you have to be deprived of support of one parent. So generally, it's only one working parent. So if I don't have childcare, I can't work. If I don't have transportation, which is another supportive service that the county is supposed to provide, then I can't work. So those are good cause. And if that's the case, someone shouldn't be sanctioned. If they're dealing with a family crisis, like let's say, you know, my mom is in the hospital, and I needed to be there for her. That could be good cause. If I lost my job because I was discriminated against, that could be good cause. Like I was fired for retaliation because they weren't paying overtime. Good cause. If this sometimes comes up, if the only jobs that I can find are too remote from me. And there's a definition too. I think if it's more than 2 hours a day round trip on the bus, you can argue remoteness. So let's say I live in like a very, outside San Martin, and the only services that are available to do my welfare to work are an hour and a half away by bus. That's 3 hours a day round trip. That's too remote. So I have good cause for not participating. So if you see someone who says, oh, I used to get CalWORKS, but I got sanctioned, or I used to get CalWORKS, but I didn't do my hours, so I got cut off, that's a flag for a referral to legal services. Because like I said, a lot of times these things just come down to communication. It may be that the client didn't know they could have explained good cause, or maybe they tried to explain, but the person they explained it to didn't listen or didn't understand. And so those are situations where someone can actually be, you can call it curing a sanction. They could cure their sanction and get back on aid. Okay, so what else can you get besides aid? Okay, so there are supportive services as well that are supposed to support the family in becoming employable. And they're often designed to address different barriers to employability. So they can be things like counseling to provide mental health support around issues like domestic violence, drug or alcohol use. They can also be transportation costs to commute to and from work or school. And that also includes the transportation to and from childcare if you need that childcare in order to do work or school. CalWORKS can pay for clothing, uniforms, and tools that are needed for a job. They can also pay licensing fees. So let's say you are a certified nurse's assistant and there's a certain annual fee you have to pay. They can also pay for books and supplies for school. And most importantly, most expensively, one of the tragedies I see sometimes is families who are unable to work as many hours as they could because they don't have childcare for that. And like I've literally seen parents who are on CalWORKS who said, well, I can't work more hours because I can't afford to pay more childcare. And I say, well, aren't you getting free childcare through CalWORKS? And sometimes the answer is no. So nobody on CalWORKS should be paying for childcare. And if they need more childcare hours so they can work more or do more job training, there should be ways for them to get it. So that's another thing. If you see a family with childcare needs, that's a big flag for referral for help with CalWORKS. Okay. Exempt individuals can volunteer and get trainings and support services as well. That's often where I see the lack with childcare. Someone who maybe was fleeing a DV situation, they were exempted from welfare to work, but they start being able to do some hours. They're working a few hours, but they're paying out of pocket for childcare because they never got referred to welfare to work because they were exempt. And in Santa Clara County, welfare to work is the unit that approves childcare. So what we would want to do in that situation is help explain that they can volunteer their hours, meaning they can do the same job. They are just voluntarily participating in work activity, and then they can get the hours paid for childcare. Some other issues that sometimes come up, immediate needs processing for initial applicants. So normally it can take up to like 30 days to process CalWORKS. In Santa Clara County, it rarely takes that long. But if the family has an emergency need, most commonly shelter, medical care, fleeing domestic violence, or facing an eviction, and they appear to be eligible, and they have less than $100 in cash or liquid resources, or if it's an eviction and they have less than they owe on the eviction. And some like fairy godmother community agency isn't swooping in to hand them buckets of cash, then they should be able to get their CalWORKS processed within 2 working days. And the full application within 15 days. So they can get up to $200 within 2 working days, the full application within 15 days. And if they have an eviction notice, they are supposed to get the full grant within 3 days. And so in Santa Clara County, it is often possible to process the next business day, sometimes even the same business day. But that is definitely an issue where we see people who have evictions who apply and it just doesn't get flagged properly that they need immediate need. So that is a term of art. If I were sending someone to apply, I would, first of all, I would make every effort to like actually go with them and to flag and say immediate need. We need to be processed for immediate need. And they should be able to get that the same day. Including some things called homeless assistance. Yeah.
Someone asked, how does someone obtain the referral for additional assistance for childcare?
So childcare is run by the Welfare to Work unit of CalWORKS. And so they can either, if they have a Welfare to Work worker, they can just ask their Welfare to Work worker, make sure they know that their hours have changed and ask for more hours of childcare. Otherwise, if they don't have a Welfare to Work worker, they have probably been exempted. And what they need to do is volunteer for Welfare to Work. When I say volunteer for Welfare to Work, I don't mean like they're going to volunteer at some like, you know, food bank or something like that. I mean, they are voluntarily participating by working the job they already have. Or they can get assigned to, you know, they can get help finding a job if they want to. But often it's that they already have a job and they can just say, I'm working, I want to get childcare. Their eligibility worker should refer them to Welfare to Work, or they can self-refer to Welfare to Work, which is just a different building on Center Road.
And generally you have to attend an orientation and then you'll get assigned an employment counselor who can make that referral to childcare or any of these other services we're going to be talking about.
And they have to provide childcare for the orientation too. So they have made some changes in recent years where childcare is supposed to be available immediately and continuously throughout the CalWORKS process. The experience of CalWORKS applicants, I will say, has really varied, not just by county, but within counties. We see people who, some people are able to get it very smoothly from the beginning and some people really struggle. So if anyone is having any issues related to childcare, that's also just a thing to flag and refer to legal aid. We can often help smooth that out. Okay.
Homeless assistance. So homeless assistance can be provided to families, including families with eviction notices, but not exclusively to families with eviction notices. There are 2 types of homeless assistance. There's temporary homeless assistance and permanent homeless assistance. And a family can get either type or they could get both types. They're not mutually exclusive. But it should be noted that each type is only available once every 12 months. So once every 12 months, you can get both temporary homeless assistance and permanent homeless assistance, unless you meet one of the exceptions to the once every 12-month rule. Some examples of the exceptions are habitability. So if your home has habitability issues, but you do need to be able to provide proof. If there is some sort of disaster that is preventing you from being in your home, DV-related homelessness. So if you're fleeing your abuser, it does require a sworn statement, and you may need a plan, but they can't require that you attend DV counseling. I would note that there is also there is a disability-related exception, but the disability has to be related to the cause of homelessness.
And when someone is sort of gets transferred to different eligibility workers and maybe they don't know who their eligibility worker is, how can the client find out who that person is? Or typically, how long does it take for that person to get reassigned an eligibility worker if they're getting transferred to someone else?
That's a great question. It's a little different county by county. So this answer is Santa Clara specific. In Santa Clara County, we have cases assigned, I believe still, last it was explained to me, cases are assigned to pools of eligibility workers. And then whoever picks it up to do, for example, the initial eligibility will complete the initial eligibility. But then if like you later have a different question, like it may go back in the pool and another worker in that pool may pick it up and handle that next issue. You should be able to call the CalWORKS office to find out who the worker is, but in Santa Clara County, we also have an ombudsman, and it's ombudsman at ssa.scc.gov.org. And you can contact the ombudsman's office as well to find out who your worker is and just be able to like know who to talk to.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the two types of homeless assistance now. So the first one is temporary homeless assistance. And so this type of homeless assistance is more like the immediate, I am being evicted, I need somewhere to go, I don't have anywhere to go. And what it will do is it'll provide $85 a day for a motel. And that $85 is for a family of 4 or less. The amount increases $15 for each additional person up to a maximum of $145 a day. You can only get temporary homeless assistance for up to 16 days in a row. And families are eligible to receive this money the same day they ask for it. There are requirements for continuing to receive the temporary homeless assistance, such as a home searching, and they provide you a form where you have to complete that for each day you receive temporary homeless assistance. You need to contact at least one housing provider to inquire about housing. In addition, CalWORKS applicants that are fleeing abusers shall be deemed homeless, and they're going to be eligible for up to 32 days of temporary homeless assistance, and they disregard any income or resources of the alleged abuser. All right, and then the second type of homeless assistance is permanent homeless assistance. And like I said, you can get both within a 12-month period. For permanent homeless assistance, the county will help pay a security deposit and the last month's rent for new housing, but only if the new housing's rent is 80% or less of the monthly household income. Or in order to prevent housing, the county can pay up to 2 months of back rent in order to prevent an eviction. And they're required to provide this money 1 business day after it is asked for.
Okay, so those two programs that Juliana just mentioned, the temporary homeless assistance and permanent homeless assistance, are those exist in every county in California. You have an absolute right to them if you are eligible, if you meet the criteria. The other programs I'm going to talk about next look a little different. So there's the housing support program, and then I'll talk about the family support program. HSP, or the housing support program, it exists in every county, but it looks a little different because the counties have kind of discretion of how to design them. So if you've ever worked in a different county, their HSP program may look different. This is about Santa Clara County's HSP. So first of all, one of the criteria is that CalWORKS families that are homeless or at risk of homelessness should be eligible for HSP. They do not need to be doing welfare to work. And that is a really important distinction because the HSP program is run in Santa Clara County by the welfare to work unit, but you do not need to be a welfare to work participant in order to apply. So if, let's say, the adult is ineligible due to immigration status, or because they're on disability benefits or whatever, they're exempt, they can still get HSP. They can also be referred by the county, by the eligibility worker, by their welfare to work worker, or they can self-refer. So like you can help a client, like if you see a client who seems like they could benefit from the housing support program, they can just ask to be referred. The services that are available in Santa Clara County, there are a lot of them. I apologize for the small font. But this is one of the only ways that folks on CalWORKS can get intensive case management, which can be really helpful, including assistance locating and securing housing. That housing search assistance is really valuable for folks. They can also pay security deposit, first month rent, or deposit last month rent. They may do that through the Permanent Homeless Assistance Program, but they can also do it directly through the HSP. Emergency lodging, hotel assistance, utility payments needed to retain or obtain housing. If someone's in danger of losing their apartment because they can't pay the PG&E and the electricity got cut off or the water got disconnected. Moving arrangements and moving costs, help understanding leases, renter's insurance if needed, if like that's required to get the apartment, they can help with renter's insurance. Short-term housing subsidy that gradually transitions to full payment. So this is not a long-term Section 8 voucher, but it can give the family like an on-ramp to paying their own full rent. So you still want the full rent to be affordable, but they don't necessarily need to pay it all right away if they're getting that service. Mediation and outreach to landlords, financial education referrals, incentives, and other service referrals to support housing. The incentives, they actually have like matching savings programs and things like that to help families move towards long-term stability as well.
And we've got a few questions about this. So for this housing support program, what if the parent is not legal, although their children are?
Okay, so if the parent is not an eligible non-citizen, then they can still qualify for the HSP. That should not be a barrier. I will say though, because many years ago, when Santa Clara first formed its HSP, they did restrict the program to welfare to work participants. Many workers are still confused and still think that's the case. So if they got denied for that reason, that would also be a reason to refer them. This is designed to help the whole family, including the eligible children.
Okay, great. And we've got quite a few questions coming in about this. So how long is the rental support for?
So I did not include it because it's not officially listed on the county website. So I believe it can vary depending on the funding available. So counties do get like a certain amount allocated to run their HSP programs. So there may be some variation in there. I have seen families in the like 5 or 6 month range. Like I said, this is not a long-term housing subsidy.
Okay, so that might sort of answer the next question. Would a housing support program be the equivalent to rapid rehousing?
It can be sort of. In Santa Clara County, oftentimes participants in HSP are referred to sister agencies that run portions of the HSP program. So for Santa Clara County, oftentimes people are referred to OSH or they are referred to Sacred Heart, and part of OSH and Sacred Heart's programs could involve rapid rehousing. So I hope that answers the question.
These programs are intended by the state to be braided together with other housing programs that are run, for example, in Santa Clara by OSH, the Office of Supportive Housing. In practice, I think that is always a goal that everybody is working towards. And so it doesn't always happen that way in practice for every family. But the idea is that, yes, a family can come in on the CalWORKS side. They can get temporary or homeless or permanent homeless assistance, or they can get HSP. And then, while that may not provide a permanent housing subsidy, they can be assisted with things that will help them increase their financial capacity. They can also, if, for example, like they're going to need a longer term subsidy, maybe because like a parent has a disability that's going to, limit their employment ability long term, like they may be able to get connected with agencies that can help them get longer term supports. So yeah, I think the goal is for it to work seamlessly. And I think that's a really important role that a lot of the attendees here, I know you are all not working directly with CalWORKS, but you may be working more on the side of those working with agencies that do some of that other work with those other housing programs. So part of what we're trying to do today is increase the braiding together and the understanding of those other programs.
Yeah, and I think that sort of goes to some of the questions that folks have in terms, somebody asked, like, is the referral that somebody gets this program, for example, can it be the VSPDAT? Yeah.
I don't think it would be.
Okay.
I think that I don't believe the CalWORKS office does the VSPDAT, but they would likely refer someone like to Sacred Heart or to the Office of Supportive Housing where that could be completed.
Gotcha. And then somebody else asked, is the housing support program different than Section 8?
Yes, they are different programs. Like we said, the housing support program isn't going to provide any sort of permanent ongoing housing support. It is temporary versus Section 8, which once someone is on Section 8, they do have to do their annual recertifications, but that is a much more permanent form of housing support.
Excellent. And we are going to do a little bit of a hustle through some of our next slides because I'm loving the questions. I like this much more as an interactive kind of like conversation. But I also think the scenarios that we have at the end might be useful for folks. So we're going to try and get there in the next 30 minutes. Okay. Santa Clara County also has something they call the FSP, Family Services Program, and this is also a voluntary program. This is kind of designed to be more on the prevention side, particularly on prevention of families needing to interact more with Department of Family and Children's Services, CPS. So it focuses on a lot of things like counseling, individual and family counseling, social work services, at-risk youth services. It connects people with HSP, but you can get HSP without doing FSP, parenting classes, stress management, SSI application and help. Legal assistance, as far as I know, that's just referring people to legal aid. I don't think they actually have lawyers that are doing the FSP. And like support around school attendance, financial literacy, and other emergency needs. So just some other resources to know for families who need that support. And it's completely voluntary. Nobody can get penalized If they get referred for Family Services Program or HSP and they don't connect, they cannot be penalized for not doing that. Okay.
All right.
So
I could go, Lisa. So on top of all the welfare to work things that you need to do, there are additional things that you need to do in order to keep your CalWORKS. The first thing is going to be semi-annual reporting. These are redeterminations. They generally happen annually. And then there is they call it a SAR 7. It's a type of form. Those generally happen about every 6 months, and it's to report changes to your income, resources, family composition, those types of things. Families must report any reasonably anticipated income, which is a term of art, and anything that may change their eligibility. The grant amount will stay the same for 6 months unless income goes over the reporting threshold. Each assistance unit or family should be notified of their income reporting threshold. And if they're not notified of that, then they should be referred to legal aid if they end up having problems for not properly reporting. And so we always advise clients report everything, even if they're not sure. And it's always best to try to report things in writing. That way you have some form of documentation that you did report it, because oftentimes things can slip through the cracks.
okay, so the sorts of changes that a household is going to want to report are basically changes to people and changes to money. If someone moves in or out of the household, often, just like the rest of the world, families on CalWORKS, there are often people moving in or out of households where it's kind of like a gradient of when someone starts living with you versus like a clear, bright line move-in day. So as a rule of thumb, if someone is spending more than 50% of their time at the household, they should report them as living there. If they live there less than 50% of time, but spend a substantial amount of time at the household, that is where we often see allegations of fraud, allegations that this person's living with you, but you didn't report it. And so it's really important for people to like create a paper trail of who's living with you or who is living elsewhere. So for example, if your sister who is homeless spends the night on your couch 2 or 3 nights a week, you can easily see someone making an allegation that she's living with you. It's really important to document that she doesn't actually live with you most of the time, that she's not considered a household member. Change of address, change of immigration status, change of student status, particularly for college students. Change of disability status, your income goes up, your income goes down. Most folks on CalWORKS are working hourly wage jobs, so their income goes up and down all the time because their schedule changes. Households get asset, household sells an asset. Those are things to report. As far as the hours going up and down, the income going up and down, like Juliana said, there's an income reporting threshold that each family is supposed to be informed of. It's not the same for every family, and it's not necessarily the same for CalWORKS and CalFresh. So you can have an amount of income that you need to report for CalWORKS purposes, but you don't need to report for CalFresh. Child support cooperation. The recipient must generally assign child support rights to the county, meaning the county gets to collect and keep child support for the months the child is on aid, and the family gets a pass-through amount. Related to this, recipients must generally cooperate with establishing paternity and enforcing child support. But there is a good cause waiver, and the reasons to ask for a waiver of child support cooperation is if it would increase the risk of abuse to the participant or the child, to the adult or the child, if the child was conceived as a result of abuse, or any other reason it would not be in the child's best interest, such as, for example, if you think it would increase the risk that the abuser is going to, maybe they're not going to abuse the child directly, but they will attempt to get custody in order to control the survivor, if you file for child support, if they know where you are. That is something we see all the time. We also see all the time where the abuser will try to, if they find out you're on CalWORKS, they will make false fraud referrals to harass you, to cause problems. And that's another reason not to, because if you open a child support case, the abuser will be notified that you are on CalWORKS and what county you live in. So just something to think when deciding whether to seek good cause or not. Okay, 60-month time limit. Is this you or me, Juliana?
I was supposed to do the last slide, Lisa, but I didn't want to interrupt you.
I was on a roll.
So the 60-month time limit, adults are limited to 60 months on aid. So an adult household member or adult assistance unit member is only allowed to receive 60 months of CalWORKS. This is a lifetime limit. So that they can't get months back unless they have exempt months. I say that with a lot of caveats. There are exempt months, so there are months that you can be an adult on CalWORKS that do not count towards that limit, such as if you are unable to participate due to domestic violence, you're disabled or injured at least 30 days, you're caring for sick or disabled family members, you're caring for a child under the age of 24 months, or you're age 60 or older. There can also be extensions to the 60-month time on aid limit, and those extensions would happen after the 60 months is reached. Some reasons for extensions, again, would be domestic violence, caring for sick or disabled family members, or being ages 60 or older. The months the county received child support from an unaided parent do not count against that 60 months on aid. We call it your time clock for aid, but the months the child support is received should not count against your time on aid. All right, so CalWORKS rules for survivors of abuse. As you've probably seen throughout the presentation, there are a lot of special rules surrounding domestic violence and other forms of abuse. And so we're kind of just going to review some of those rules now. So family violence options. FVO, so county welfare departments must identify applicants who are abuse victims while protecting eligibility. They must refer the abuse victims to domestic violence support services, and they have to waive any program requirements for as long as necessary if the rules make it difficult to escape abuse or they unfairly penalize families. But they cannot waive deprivation assets and income requirements in order to be eligible for the program. So how to prove abuse? There are a few ways to prove abuse. I think the most common one is a sworn statement, and sworn statements should be sufficient unless the county is able to show in writing an independent, reasonable basis for finding the recipient not credible. Other ways to prove abuse are any other evidence. So basically examples would be a letter from a DV agency certifying that you are a victim of abuse, legal aid support, a letter from a legal aid, any sort of police reports, copies of restraining orders, things of those nature. But it's really important to note, and it should kind of go without saying, but the county cannot contact the abuser for any sort of corroborating information. Part of the program and part of the protections of survivors in the program is to protect people from their abuser. So the county should not be contacting the abuser once you have flagged that you are a victim. Asking for waivers. So like we said, people can get waivers for certain program requirements. So to ask for a waiver, you can ask in writing, or you should ask in writing. There is no form, but I believe we have provided a sample, which will be emailed out as part of the presentation materials. There's no time limit for asking for a waiver, so you don't have to ask when you first apply. You can ask at any point in time. So, you know, a lot of times people don't feel comfortable revealing their domestic violence situation initially, and they may want to ask later, and they are able to do that. Part of that is there are prospective waivers, retroactive waivers, and those retroactive waivers could be getting time back on their time clock. And then months in which a person has a waiver does not count toward the 48-month time limit. There is a 48-month time limit after someone reveals abuse, and they can only get 36 months added back to the 48-month clock. I think it's a 60-month clock, Lisa. I think the slide needs to be updated.
Yes, sorry. The 48-month clock was changed to a 60-month clock about a year ago. So apologies.
Yes.
This slide needs to be fixed.
Yeah.
Yep, and just a note quickly that whenever someone asks for a DV waiver, if the county denies it or grants it, they're supposed to get a notice. The county can't just ignore it. Okay. And they have the right to appeal that denial or approval of the DV waiver. Okay. So if someone's asked for a DV waiver and they haven't heard anything from the county for an unreasonable period of time, I would say if they haven't heard anything within a couple weeks, that would be something you could refer to legal aid as well. Okay, so what sort of problems do people run into with CalWORKS? So far, we've been focusing on how the program should work and the services people should be able to get. But Juliana and I wouldn't have jobs if everything worked perfectly every time. And I also just want to say, like, it's not bad to refer people to legal aid. We work with the county often very closely to ensure that people are getting everything they're eligible for. And it's part of our role to help, like often it's like gaps in information, gaps in communication. And so that's why people aren't getting what they're supposed to. These rules are also very complex and they're constantly changing. So sometimes workers are not familiar with a specific exception to a specific general rule. And that's part of what we do is we identify what the actual rule and the exception and whether the client qualifies and help provide the evidence. So it's really helpful to refer people when they're struggling with CalWORKS. Okay, so application processes. You can file a joint application for CalFresh, Medi-Cal, and CalWORKS using one form. It's actually changed. We need to update this slide as well. It used to be mybenefitscalwin.org as of February in Santa Clara County. It is now just benefitscal.org. So benefitscal, and that is on the county website. So, but I would not recommend using that county website application if the client is an immigrant other than a green card holder, or if they are seeking emergency processing of the aid or same-day homeless assistance. If that is the case, I would personally still send the client in person to Center Road, or if you're in South County, to the Gilroy office, because that will allow them to do it more quickly, and they need to it will ensure that they are processed that same day if need be. Because they will still need to provide verifications. Scanning and uploading documents can be challenging for folks. If that is something you are working with a family and you are able to assist them with making sure they are able to scan and upload documents to that Benefits Cal website, That's really helpful. And CBOs can actually apply to get a CBO account for Benefits Cal so that you can assist multiple participants with that process. So that's something some of your orgs may want to consider. Just examples of some of the types of proofs and documentations clients may be asked for: identity docs like IDs, SSNs, birth or marriage certificates to show relationships, proof of what non-citizen status they have if they're applying to be part of the unit, verification of shelter costs, verification of income, car information, proof of student status, and more. In order to process them on an emergency basis, many of these items can be deferred. So just because they don't have all of that on day one, they should be able to still be processed for immediate need. And then they can provide all that within like the 15-day window. The number one reason people are denied for CalWORKS is not because they're not eligible, it's because they didn't finish the verification process. For survivors who are non-citizens, some of these folks may be eligible for CalWORKS before they have an SSN. That can be a common misunderstanding by workers and a reason for an incorrect denial. Sometimes they'll think that the computer system requires an SSN in order for them to be in the unit. They'll say you don't have, you can't be in the unit until you get an SSN. That's not true. They can also accept non-standard identity documents. And for trafficking survivors, a sworn statement that they are a trafficking survivor is enough. So they don't need to have an immigration document yet if they're a trafficking survivor. Some common issues that come up for mixed status families. Ineligible individuals, as we mentioned, can apply for benefits on behalf of family members. And they can distinguish between applicants and non-applicants. They're going to have to list everybody in the family, but they can say, for example, mom and the youngest 3 children are applying for CalWORKS. Dad and let's say the oldest adult child are living in the household but not applying. Non-applicants are not required to provide their immigration status, and please do not volunteer it if it is not helpful. Non-applicants without an SSN cannot be required to provide one. This should also go without saying, but never provide an SSN to social services or any other government agency unless it was officially issued by the Social Security Administration. So one that you got at La Tropicana is not one you want to provide to social services. They care about your income. So you do want to report your income, but please never provide false or misleading information. Information provided on the application can only use to be determined eligibility for benefits. So it is protected by state law, and they are not to disclose it to, like, for example, ICE. It's actually a criminal penalty to disclose confidential welfare information under California law. So that is a common question I get from mixed status families who are worried about providing information. It is better to provide accurate income information, though, than to hide income information because you're worried about getting in trouble for not having an SSN. Okay, public charge. This is just the fear that getting benefits will somehow hurt an applicant's immigration status. But almost no immigrants who are impacted by public charge are eligible for CalWORKS. So it has a little nugget of fact in that some applicants for family-based immigration or employer-based immigration or certain other visas may be subject to a public charge test where they look at whether they are likely to be dependent on the government in the future. And one of the factors they can look at is whether they've gotten cash aid in the past. But most people who do not yet have a green card and are applying for a family-based pathway are not eligible for CalWORKS themselves. So if their kids are US citizens and got CalWORKS, that doesn't matter at all. If you already have a green card, it doesn't matter at all unless you do something to forfeit your green card and you have to reapply for a green card, which you shouldn't do anyways. It also doesn't apply to most humanitarian immigrants like U visa, T visa, CIGIS, asylee, refugee, temporary protected status, the Ukraine humanitarian parolees, the special immigrant visa holders from Afghanistan. None of these people who are eligible for CalWORKS are subject to public charge, these humanitarian immigrants. And like I said, any other family members getting aid doesn't impact the immigrant. So if mom is applying for a visa through, let's say, her parent who is now a US citizen, she can get aid for the kids without any fear. Okay. Is this me or you, Juliana?
You were going to do this section, but
Okay.
if you want, I can finish the last 2 slides.
That's okay. I think we're almost done. We've got appeals and the right to request a hearing before an administrative law judge to appeal any sort of county action. You generally have to file an appeal within 90 days of the date that you got this thing in writing that said what the county decided. That paper is called a notice of action. But that 90 days only starts running if the county actually sent you the notice and if the notice was adequate. So it's not an adequate notice if it's in a language you don't read. It's not an adequate notice if the county knows you need reasonable accommodations in order to understand written material, like you're blind, and they didn't provide those accommodations. And it's not adequate if the paper doesn't actually describe like what the county decided and the facts they based their decision on. So if the paper just says you're terminated because you have income, that's not an adequate notice. Okay, you can also file within 180 days if you have good cause for not requesting it earlier. There's the fax number, believe it or not, yes, we still do faxes in the 21st century. And there is a statewide 800 number that you can also call to request a hearing over the phone. What legal rights do people have in public benefits programs? They have the right to be treated without discrimination based under all the various protected statuses under California law. They have the right to language access, to disability accommodations, to confidentiality, as we mentioned, to adequate notice, like they can't just turn you away and say, no, you're not eligible, you shouldn't apply. They have to let you apply. You have to be given an opportunity to see if you agree or disagree with the reasons they said you were ineligible. And you have the right to file an administrative appeal. That is on the back of every notice of action. You also have the right to have legal representation. What this means is that if you choose to appeal, you have the right to bring an attorney with you if you can find one. It's not like criminal court where you can get one appointed for you and you like are promised that you have an attorney. So there are only a very small handful of folks that practice public benefits law at nonprofits in Santa Clara County. There are no private food stamps attorneys. There are no private CalWORKS attorneys. And so folks do need to get referred to an agency, and then we help as many folks as we can. But we can't promise that we can represent everybody. If folks want to get referred for intake, they can contact us at our intake unit. It opens at 9:30 every morning, Monday through Thursday, until it reaches capacity, which is usually around noon. But I tell people call sooner rather than later. Okay.
Lisa, I want to know, should we do the scenarios or should we answer questions? Because I'm sure there are questions in the chat. What?
Should we pick one scenario and then do some questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a favorite, Juliana?
I don't have a favorite. I mean, for Carla's benefit with the polling questions, maybe we do the first one.
That sounds good. Okay.
Okay.
So Gloria is 37 years old, came to the US a few years ago to join her sister Anna. Anna went to Texas to look for work and never came back. Now Gloria works part-time, but she also takes care of her niece, Sophia. She loves Sophia, but worries about whether she can afford to raise her. She's been renting a room. She just got an eviction notice. These scenarios are all compilations of real clients we have worked with. Gloria would love to get them a place of their own and to keep raising Sophia, but she is worried if they become homeless, she will lose her to foster care. So our questions are, do Gloria and Anna qualify for CalWORKS? Oh, sorry, it's Sophia, the niece. That's okay. We'll rename them. The niece is Anna now. Okay. Okay. Possibly. Do they qualify for CalWORKS? Possibly. We need more information. Yes. Okay. What sorts of information do we need? Let's look at the next polling question.
Maybe we'll give folks like 30 more seconds. I'll give folks a 10-second warning when we're going to close it. Great, so about 10 more seconds. All right, so I'm going to end the poll.
Okay.
Yeah, so we
Oh, go ahead.
definitely need all of the above, right? We definitely need financial information, immigration information, and there might be other things we need, right? Like we might need information about where Sophia's dad is. Is there a child support order in place? Yeah, there could be a ton of other things we need.
Yeah, now, does Gloria need legal custody? No. She can just be a caretaker without formal court orders. Financial information. If all the income is Gloria's work, Gloria may or may not be eligible for the unit based on how much her work information is. But if she's not eligible, she could have her niece in a unit of her own. So even if Gloria makes too much to qualify for CalWORKS, she could get CalWORKS just for her niece. And likewise, one of them may be eligible based on their immigration status and another may not. So a lot of information we need to know whether they're both eligible. It is likely in this scenario, though, that they may be eligible. And one of the things we might look for is, given that eviction notice, whether they would qualify also for emergency processing. That's that immediate need, and homeless assistance. Okay.
Should I go ahead and launch the next one?
Yes.
Sure. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot we added this question this year.
So we'll give folks like 20 more questions or 20 more seconds, not 20 more questions.
Don't worry, Lisa. I didn't put it on here, the immediate need, so it's okay.
Okay.
The answers got a little unruly. Too many things.
All right, so about 10 more seconds for folks to answer. Great, I'm going to close the poll now and then share the results.
So yeah, if they are eligible, they would be eligible for all of these things. Based on the scenario that we have, they would be eligible for welfare to work supportive services, cash aid. They could be eligible for temporary homeless assistance and permanent homeless assistance, the housing support program. And apparently I put on here twice cash aid and homeless assistance, but that as well.
Yeah, I think something that's often a misconception is that only a parent can get childcare. Gloria, as an aunt, may be eligible to be exempt from welfare to work requirements if the county determines that her niece is at risk of entering foster care. So she may not need to work, but if she can work, she certainly should be able to and should be able to get childcare. And that childcare can be worth like 10 times as much as the family's monthly grant amount in some cases. Childcare is very expensive. And this is one of the only on-ramps to guaranteed subsidized childcare in California right now, especially for young children.
Thanks, y'all. Looks like we have 3 minutes left. I would probably think maybe we could, I have noted down the questions we received in the chat in order, and we could probably get through like 2 questions, and then I can pop the feedback form in the chat for folks to just open up on their computers, and we can send folks on their way, if that works.
That sounds
Excellent.
great.
Awesome. So the first question we got was, can families get assistance from the homeless? Well, I'm just going to call it HSP and another program, or would it be considered double dipping? Would the household still qualify?
It would depend on the other program and the services provided in the other program. So hard to answer. Potentially they could get both, but it would really depend on the program and those services.
Great. And then the other question is, if a teen gets a job, does that income count towards the income of the household?
There are certain rules that specifically apply to teens that we didn't have time to get into today. And the teen can either be the minor or they can be the parent. So there are specific services for parenting teens as well that we didn't get into, which can be really cool. A program called CalLearn, and it includes like financial incentives for staying in school, stipends, things like that. But yeah, there are special rules around how the income of a like high school student counts. I assume we're talking about a high school teen. And yes, there are certain situations in which their income can be exempt.
Well, thank you so much, Juliana and Lisa. I do want to note that there are a few other questions we didn't get to, but what I'll do is I'll send them to Juliana and Lisa over email and get a response for y'all, and then send that over with the post